They handcuffed me for sitting in a chair in my own lobby of the building I own part of. I didn't break anything, didn't yell, didn't even bring loud music. Just tried to chat with a few neighbors, like normal people do. But our HOA president, Pamela, who thinks she's some kind of sheriff with a clipboard, called the cops like I was robbing the place. What happened next? Let's just say the ending had a twist that even Matlock would have stood up and clapped for. Ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA? Tell me in the comments, because if I'm crazy, I want to know how many of us are out here together. My name is Derek Hartman, and 8 months ago, I thought I'd finally made it. At 35, and after working 15 years maintaining industrial equipment, a workplace accident changed everything. Not in a bad way, surprisingly. The settlement money, combined with every penny I'd saved since I was 18, finally let me buy something I'd only dreamed about. A penthouse. Not some massive Manhattan thing, mind you, but a beautiful corner unit on the 8th floor of Phoenix Gardens, a luxury building in Phoenix, Arizona. For a guy who grew up in a trailer park and worked with his hands his whole life, this was everything. I had promised my father, back when I was still working in the shop, that someday I would buy a place I could truly call home. And today, I had done it. The building was everything I'd hoped for. Clean, quiet, professional. The lobby was gorgeous with comfortable seating and enough room for probably 50 people to sit comfortably. I loved coming down in the evenings just to sit and read, maybe answer some emails. It felt like having a private library that I actually owned a piece of. For the first few weeks, life was perfect. I'd wake up in my dream apartment, work on some freelance consulting from home, and spend my evenings in that beautiful lobby, finally living the life I'd worked so hard for. Then I met her. I was heading down to grab my mail one Tuesday morning when I noticed a woman standing in front of the community bulletin board. She was maybe 41, dressed in a business suit despite it being 10 in the morning on a weekday, with short bob-cut hair that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." But what really caught my attention was the clipboard. She held it like a weapon, and she was measuring something with a small ruler. I'm not kidding. She was literally measuring the distance between posted notices on the board. When she saw me approaching the mailboxes, she turned and looked me up and down like she was evaluating livestock. "You must be the new penthouse tenant," she said, and there was something in her tone that made it sound less like a welcome and more like an accusation. "I'm Pamela Riggs, president of the Homeowners Association. Welcome to our very well-organized community." The way she emphasized well-organized made my skin crawl. I tried to be polite. My mama raised me right, after all. "Nice to meet you, ma'am. I'm Derek Hartman." But instead of the normal pleasantries you'd expect, she immediately launched into something that would haunt me for months. "Derek, you'll need to register for lobby usage. We maintain a list of who uses our common areas and when, to ensure everything stays orderly." I stood there holding my mail key, completely confused. "Register? To sit in the lobby?" She handed me her clipboard, and I could see it had maybe 2 names on it, both written in handwriting that looked scared. "We need to track usage patterns for maintenance and community harmony purposes. It's all about maintaining proper standards." I looked at the clipboard more carefully and noticed something that should have been a red flag. There was a column labeled Violations, and it already had 3 residents' names in it. 3 people I'd never even met had apparently already done something wrong in Pamela's eyes. As I reluctantly signed my name, an older gentleman walked through the lobby. He was maybe 62, with the bearing of someone who'd seen a lot in his life. He caught my eye and gave me a look that clearly said, "Good luck, son." Later, I'd learned his name was Frank Bellamy, and that look was him recognizing another soul about to be fed to the Pamela machine. But at that moment, I just thought I was dealing with an overly organized neighbor. "Lobby is the heart of our community, Derek," Pamela continued, writing something next to my signature. "And hearts need discipline to keep beating properly." That sentence should have been my warning to run. I thought I had just bought an apartment. Turns out I had just stepped into the kingdom of the clipboard queen. 3 days later, I found a thick envelope slipped under my apartment door. The header read, "Official HOA Notice," in bold letters that somehow managed to look threatening. Inside were 3 typed pages, 3 full pages, detailing my apparent violations of community standards. I'm not exaggerating when I say I felt like I'd stepped into some alternate reality. The violations included unauthorized lobby usage without pre-registration, even though I had signed her clipboard, inappropriate attire in common areas because I'd been wearing a t-shirt, and my personal favorite, failure to acknowledge HOA authority figure with appropriate respect. I read that last one 3 times before it sank in. Apparently just saying, "Nice to meet you, ma'am," wasn't respectful enough for Queen Pamela. The document was formatted like a legal brief, complete with numbered subsections and references to Community Standards Manual Section 4.3, a manual I'd never seen and was beginning to suspect didn't actually exist. I was carrying this surreal document down to check my mail when I ran into Frank at the mailboxes. He took one look at the papers in my hand and chuckled, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You're the new guy, right? Let me guess. You got the Pamela treatment." I held up the 3-page violation notice, still in disbelief. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Frank's expression turned sympathetic as he pulled out his own set of keys. "Kid, I got 12 of these in my first month here. Violations for laughing too loud in the elevator, wearing squeaky shoes, and one memorable citation for reading my newspaper in the lobby. Reading my newspaper in the lobby." Frank looked at me seriously and added, "I used to be an aerospace engineer, worked on navigation systems for commercial aircraft for 37 years. I never thought I'd have to ask permission to eat a sandwich in my own building at my age. But that's what this place has become under her rule." The way he said it, with that mixture of frustration and resignation, I could tell this wasn't his first conversation about Pamela's reign of terror. That afternoon, I decided to do some serious research. I pulled out my purchase contract and read every single line about common area usage in HOA regulations. I also dug up the original building prospectus, the maintenance fee breakdown, and even the insurance documentation. Nowhere, and I mean absolutely nowhere, did it mention dress codes for the lobby, time limits for common areas, mandatory greetings for HOA officials, or any requirement to get permission to exist in the building I'd bought into. The more I read, the angrier I got. I'd paid good money for these amenities, and some self-appointed dictator was trying to control how I used them, based on rules she'd apparently made up on the spot. But when I came back down that evening, Pamela had posted what looked like a military codebook on the bulletin board. 2 full pages, laminated. It banned everything from reading newspapers to sipping water. I wasn't sure if I was living in a condo or auditioning for a role in a dystopian novel. Frank stood beside me and muttered, "What's next?" "We salute the thermostat before adjusting it." I chuckled, but inside I was boiling. These weren't rules. They were tools of control. I didn't move from my spot for a full 5 minutes, just staring at that board and thinking, my father didn't raise me to bow to someone with a clipboard. I looked around the massive, completely empty lobby and asked her the obvious question. "What peak hours?" "I've never seen this place crowded, and it's designed for probably 50 people. She gave me a smile that could freeze hell over. "Prevention is better than cure, Derek. We maintain high standards here to prevent problems before they start." When I pressed about who had decided on the 30-minute limit and what constituted business attire for sitting in a lobby, she just said, "The board has spoken on these matters," without mentioning who this mysterious board actually was, or when they'd supposedly met. Frank witnessed this entire exchange from across the lobby, and afterward he pulled me aside with a look of genuine concern. "Derek, you seem like a good guy, so I'm going to give you some advice. In the 5 years I've lived here, 8 people have moved out specifically because of her. Good people, normal people, who just got tired of living like prisoners in their own homes." As I stood there holding that ridiculous violation notice, watching Pamela add even more rules to control our daily lives, something became crystal clear. She wasn't managing this building, she was running a prison without bars, and I had just become her newest target. The only question was I going to be prisoner number 9 to move out, or was I going to fight back? Looking at Frank's resigned expression and thinking about those 8 families who'd been driven away, I knew I couldn't just roll over and let this continue. Someone had to make a stand. A week later, thin notices appeared under everyone's door announcing an emergency HOA meeting with less than 24 hours notice. The timing felt deliberately inconvenient, 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, when most working people would be dealing with dinner and family obligations. The meeting was scheduled for the building's small community room, but when I arrived, Pamela had transformed it into something that looked more like a military tribunal than a neighborhood gathering. She sat at the head of a long table with a stack of documents at least 2 inches thick, while folding chairs for residents were arranged in rows facing her, like we were defendants awaiting sentencing. The lighting was harsh, the room felt cold, and there was no attempt to create a welcoming atmosphere for community discussion. Only 4 people showed up: me, Frank, and 2 elderly residents who looked genuinely terrified to be there. I recognized them from the mailboxes, but had never spoken to either of them. They always seemed to scurry away whenever they saw other people coming. Now I understood why. They sat in the back row like they were trying to make themselves invisible, clutching purses and looking like they expected to be arrested at any moment. The room that should have been filled with neighbors discussing community issues felt more like a courtroom where verdicts had already been decided. Pamela read for 45 minutes straight. Not spoke. Read. With the lifeless rhythm of someone reciting tax code to a wall, she introduced rules like mandatory lunch nap time, no hallway humming, and maximum guest duration, 1 hour, 59 minutes. One elderly lady whispered, "Is she serious?" Frank replied without looking up, "Serious as a heart attack." She had prepared remarks covering 18 different topics, each with multiple subsections and references to authorities that may or may not have actually existed. The rules covered everything from elevator etiquette to hallway noise levels, required pre-approval for any guest visits lasting more than 2 hours, and common area reservations that had to be submitted 48 hours in advance with detailed justifications for usage. She read in a monotone voice like she was delivering a legal verdict, never making eye contact with any of us, never pausing for questions or comments. It was a performance designed to intimidate and exhaust rather than inform or engage. When I tried to raise my hand to ask a question about the legal basis for these new restrictions, she cut me off without even looking up from her papers. "Questions will be addressed during the designated question and answer period," she said in the same flat tone. When I asked when that would be, she replied, "At my discretion, after all official business has been concluded." But as the minutes ticked by and her monologue continued, it became clear that there would be no questions, no discussion, and no input from the people who actually lived here and paid the fees that supposedly funded this organization. After her monologue ended, she began packing up her documents with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "Any questions about tonight's presentations? No? I assume silence indicates consent and compliance. Meeting adjourned." That's when something inside me snapped. I stood up and said, "Wait just a minute. We haven't been allowed to say anything for 45 minutes. The 2 elderly residents looked at me like I'd just signed my own death warrant, but Frank was nodding encouragingly from his seat. "Nobody here requested these rules," I continued, my voice getting stronger as my anger built. "We weren't consulted, we weren't asked for input, and we certainly didn't vote on any of this. This isn't your personal monarchy." Pamela's face turned red as she snapped back, "Mr. Hartman, you are out of order." But I wasn't backing down anymore. Out of order? I'm a homeowner exercising my right to participate in community governance, not your subject. When I demanded to know what board had approved all these rules and when these meetings had taken place, she got even more defensive, her mask of professional authority finally slipping. "These rules have been approved by the board majority after careful consideration of community needs." But when I pressed her about who was actually on this board and where the meeting minutes were, her composure cracked completely. "I am the board. The other members have delegated their authority to me because they trust my judgment." Frank and I exchanged glances. This woman had basically appointed herself dictator of our building and was making up rules as she went along. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I'm going to use the lobby according to my rights as an owner and taxpayer. If you don't like it, you're welcome to sue me." The room went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming and the distant sound of traffic outside, but nobody moved or spoke for what felt like an eternity. Pamela stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing like she was calculating how to destroy me most efficiently. Finally, she said in a low, dangerous voice, "Don't test me, Derek. You have no idea what you're dealing with." But I was done being intimidated by clipboard-wielding bullies. "I'm not testing anything. I'm stating facts about my legal rights and property I own." Frank applauded quietly, and even the 2 elderly residents seemed to straighten up a little in their chairs. I realized in that moment that if I didn't stand up to this petty tyrant, nobody else would, and she'd continue terrorizing people until the building was empty except for her, and whoever was too scared to resist. But I also realized that Pamela wasn't going to let this public challenge to her authority go unanswered. The battle lines had been drawn in front of witnesses, and I had no idea how far she was willing to go to maintain her iron grip on power. The following Tuesday, I decided to put my money where my mouth was. At exactly 5:30 p.m., right in the middle of Pamela's so-called peak hours, I settled into one of the comfortable lobby chairs with a book about automotive repair and a cup of coffee from my apartment. I had chosen that particular book on purpose. It was thick enough to keep me occupied for well over 30 minutes, and there was nothing about reading automotive repair manuals that could possibly be considered disruptive. The lobby was, as usual, completely empty except for me. I wasn't being loud, wasn't playing music, wasn't bothering anyone. I was just existing in the space I'd paid for, doing something that would be considered perfectly normal in any other building in America. I could see Pamela through the lobby windows, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside her ground floor apartment, checking her watch and occasionally peering out to see if I was still there. At exactly 6 o'clock, she appeared like she'd been waiting in the bushes for this exact moment. She walked straight up to me with a stopwatch in one hand and her clipboard in the other. "Time's up, Derek." 30 minutes. Her voice had that triumphant tone of someone who'd caught a criminal red-handed. I didn't even look up from my book. "I'm reading quietly. I'm not disturbing anyone. In fact, I'm the only person here. You are in violation of clearly posted community standards. I'm asking you to vacate the lobby area immediately." The way she said asking made it clear it wasn't really a request. Her voice had that sharp edge that probably worked on the other residents, but I'd dealt with plenty of workplace bullies over the years, and I knew that giving in to unreasonable demands only made them worse. I closed my book, looked her directly in the eyes, and said as calmly as possible, "And I'm telling you once again, no. I live here, I pay for access to this space, and I'm not breaking any actual laws or reasonable rules." That's when Pamela played what she thought was her trump card. She pulled out her phone and, without any further discussion, dialed 911. I couldn't believe what I was hearing as she spoke to the operator in a voice that was suddenly shaky and scared. "I need police assistance immediately. We have a trespasser in our building who is refusing to leave after being asked multiple times. I'm the building manager, and I'm concerned for the safety of our residents." I was so shocked that I actually laughed. "Trespasser?" I said, loud enough that she had to cover the phone. "I live here. I own the penthouse." She actually smiled at me while she was still on the call, a cold, calculating smile that made me realize this woman was more dangerous than I'd thought. "Not in my lobby, you don't." 12 minutes later, yes, I timed it because I was curious how long it would take. 2 police officers walked through the front door. Officer Martinez looked to be in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who'd seen every kind of nonsense humanity could dish out. His partner, Officer Davis, was younger, maybe early 30s, and clearly newer to the job based on how he kept looking to Martinez for cues. Pamela immediately launched into what can only be described as an Oscar-worthy performance, complete with dramatic gestures and a quavering voice. "Officers, thank God you're here. This man has been sitting in our lobby for over an hour, and when I politely asked him to respect our community guidelines, he became hostile and refused to leave. I'm the HOA president, and we have clearly posted rules about common area usage that all residents agreed to follow. He's been aggressive and threatening when I try to enforce our community standards, and I'm genuinely concerned about what he might do next." The performance was so convincing that I almost believed it myself. She managed to make me sound like some kind of dangerous lunatic rather than a guy quietly reading a book in his own building. I stayed calm and pulled out my wallet. "Officers, I'm Derek Hartman. I own Penthouse 8A in this building." I handed over my ID, which clearly showed the building's address, along with a copy of my deed that I'd started carrying after the first police threat. "I pay monthly maintenance fees for access to these common areas, and I'm just sitting here reading a book. I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't been loud, and I certainly haven't been trespassing." Officer Martinez looked at my documents, looked around the enormous empty lobby, then looked back at Pamela with the expression of a man who was rapidly losing patience with the situation. "Ma'am, if he's a resident and owner in this building, we can't arrest someone for sitting in their own building's lobby." Pamela's carefully constructed composure started cracking around the edges. "But he's violating clearly established building regulations. Being a resident doesn't mean unlimited access to common areas. Officer Davis, the younger one, tried to mediate like they'd probably been trained to do. This appears to be a civil dispute between residents. You'll need to resolve this through proper legal channels or building management. But Pamela wasn't having it. Proper channels? I am the proper channel. I'm the HOA president, and he's deliberately undermining building authority. If you won't remove him, then what's the point of having laws? The two officers exchanged one of those looks that cops share when they realize they're dealing with someone who's completely lost touch with reality. After the officers left, with Officer Martinez giving me an apologetic nod, Frank appeared from wherever he'd been watching the show unfold. Son, in 30 years of fighting fires and dealing with people in crisis situations, I never saw anyone try to burn down their own building's community spirit like she just did. But as satisfying as it was to watch Pamela's first real defeat, the look in her eyes as the police walked away told me this was just round one of a much longer and more dangerous fight. After my victory with the police, I realized I needed to shift strategies. Fighting Pamela alone wasn't going to work long term. She'd just keep escalating until something really bad happened. What I needed was community support, and I had an idea for how to get it. I spent the next morning printing out copies of relevant sections from my purchase contract, specifically the parts about common area usage rights. Then I posted them on the community bulletin board under the heading, "Your Rights as Owners." 2 hours later, they were gone, but I'd already achieved my goal. 6 residents had taken photos and were spreading the word. My masterstroke came that afternoon when I printed simple flyers advertising Social Coffee Friday, free coffee and neighbor chat, Fridays at 7 p.m. in the lobby. The beauty of it was that it wasn't political, wasn't anti-Pamela, and wasn't about HOA drama. It was just neighbors getting to know each other in the space we all owned. I posted the flyers around the building and waited to see what would happen. That first Friday, I set up a simple coffee station in the lobby. Just a coffee pot, some cups, and a plate of store-bought cookies. I didn't know if anyone would show up, but by 7:15, I had Frank plus 4 other residents I'd barely met before. The conversations were eye-opening. "She fined me for leaving an umbrella in the hallway," a woman said quietly, sipping her coffee. "I had to remove my doormat," another guy chimed in. "Apparently, it didn't match the community aesthetic. It was a gift from my late wife." The room went silent for a beat. "She gave me a warning for coughing at night," someone else said, half laughing. "Guess bronchitis violates the HOA vibe now." The stories weren't just absurd, they were personal. Behind every petty rule was a scar, and suddenly we were no longer neighbors. We were comrades. But it was when an elderly woman spoke up that the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. "I used to be a teacher for 42 years, she said, her voice shaking slightly with both age and emotion. "I taught children how to be good citizens, how to respect others, how to build communities. Now, I have to live like a criminal just for putting a doormat outside my apartment. That's not how elderly people should be treated in their own homes, especially not by someone half my age who thinks a clipboard gives her the right to destroy people's dignity." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Frank, who had been listening with growing intensity, finally spoke up with more emotion than I'd ever heard from him. "I was a firefighter for over 30 years, he said, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup. "I've pulled people out of burning buildings. I've seen the worst humanity can do to each other. I've held dying people in my arms and promised them everything would be okay. But I've never, in all my years, seen neighbors have their will to live crushed like this by someone who's supposed to be serving them. This woman isn't protecting our community. She's destroying it one soul at a time." As these stories poured out, I realized that everyone in the building had been living in fear of this woman, isolated and thinking they were the only ones being targeted. The sense of relief in that room was palpable. People were finally able to share their experiences without fear of retaliation, and they were discovering they weren't alone. For the first time in years, neighbors were actually talking to each other, sharing phone numbers, making human connections that Pamela's reign of terror had prevented. At 8:15, right as our little group was really bonding and people were sharing phone numbers and making plans for next week, Pamela made her entrance. She burst through the lobby doors like she was leading a SWAT raid, clipboard in hand and fury in her eyes. "What is this gathering?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the marble walls. I stayed calm and friendly, gesturing to the coffee pot and the circle of neighbors. "Just neighbors having coffee, Pamela. You're welcome to join us." But she wasn't interested in diplomacy or community building. "This is unauthorized use of common space." When Frank pointed out that we were just drinking coffee and talking, she lost it completely. "All residents must disperse immediately. I will suspend keycard access for anyone participating." That threat was a mistake, and probably illegal. For the first time since I'd lived there, I watched residents stand up to her as a group. The guy from the 5th floor said, "You can't lock us out of our own building." The woman from the 6th floor added, "We're not doing anything wrong." The elderly teacher, who seemed to have found her voice and her fighting spirit, said, "This is exactly why we need to meet regularly, so bullies like you can't pick us off one by one." Pamela looked around at the 7 determined faces staring back at her and realized she was outnumbered for the first time in probably years. She made a few more empty threats about calling the police and reporting us for trespassing, but everyone just laughed. We all knew how that had worked out for her last time. Finally, she retreated, but the damage was done. The community had tasted freedom, and there was no going back. After she left, the energy in the room was absolutely electric. People were making plans to attend next week, talking about organizing other community activities like game nights and book clubs, and for the first time, asking what we could actually do about Pamela's reign of terror. Someone suggested we should start a petition. Another person mentioned looking into HOA laws, and Frank offered to help research our legal options. I told them I was looking into our options, but privately I was already formulating a plan that would either end this nightmare or escalate it to a level none of us were prepared for. 1 cup of coffee and a few conversations. Sometimes that's the most powerful punch you can throw. The week after our coffee revolution, Pamela launched what can only be described as a counterinsurgency campaign. Every resident received a notice under their door titled, "Unauthorized Gatherings Prohibited," threatening to revoke common area privileges for anyone who participated in unsanctioned activities. She claimed our coffee meetup violated health codes and fire safety regulations, neither of which made any sense for 7 people sitting in a 200 square meter space designed for gatherings. But her desperation gave me the opening I needed, and more importantly, it showed the entire building just how unhinged she was becoming. Frank helped me dig into the building's administrative records, and what we found was explosive. The original HOA bylaws, buried in the building management office like some kind of forgotten constitution, revealed that Pamela had never actually been elected to her position. She'd simply appointed herself after the previous president moved out 3 years ago, and had been running an unauthorized dictatorship ever since. Even better, the bylaws clearly stated that any 1/3 of residents could call for a vote of no confidence in HOA leadership. With 42 units in the building, I needed just 14 signatures to force a community meeting. We just needed 14 signatures, and we had 19 people immediately say, "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." Frank and I spent the next 3 days going door to door, and the stories we heard were absolutely heartbreaking. A woman on the 2nd floor told us Pamela had fined her grandson for riding a scooter in the hallway. A 6-year-old kid just trying to have fun. An elderly man on the 4th floor admitted he was scared of Pamela, but thought maybe it was time someone stood up to her before she drove out everyone who couldn't fight back. A young couple on the 3rd floor said they'd been planning to move specifically because of the hostile environment Pamela had created, even though they loved their apartment and couldn't really afford to relocate. But it was when we met a veteran on the 6th floor that the full scope of Pamela's psychological warfare became crystal clear. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan," he told us, his hands visibly shaking as he spoke. "I've been in firefights. I've had bombs go off 50 feet from me. I've never been afraid of anything in my entire life. But every time I see that woman coming down the hallway with that damn clipboard, my hands start trembling with anger because I know she's going to find something to punish me for. That's not fear, that's rage at injustice, and I'm tired of feeling that way in my own home." Not everyone was brave enough to sign. Some residents were genuinely terrified of retaliation, especially the older folks who felt like they couldn't handle a prolonged conflict. But enough people had reached their breaking point, and more importantly, they'd seen from our coffee meeting that they weren't alone anymore. By day 3, I had 19 signatures, well over the required minimum, and representing nearly half the occupied units in the building. The petition requested a community meeting to hold a vote of no confidence in Pamela's leadership, and it was completely legal under the building's governing documents. When Frank and I presented it to the building management company, the property manager actually looked relieved, like someone had finally thrown him a lifeline. "Honestly, we've been waiting for something like this," he admitted. "She calls us 10 times a week with complaints about residents, demands we take action on things that aren't violations, and we've been getting pressure from the parent company to resolve the situation before it affects property values." Somehow, word of the petition got back to Pamela, probably through one of the few residents who were still scared enough to report to her, and her reaction was swift and predictable. She called an emergency board meeting, though since she was apparently the only board member, it was really just her talking to herself in the community room for 2 hours. She then tried to declare the petition invalid, claiming the signatures had been coerced through manipulation and conspiracy against lawful authority. When that didn't work, she started making personal threats, going door to door, and telling people she would sue them for defamation and harassment if they didn't withdraw their signatures. A few people got scared and asked to be removed from the petition, but most residents just got angrier. But it was too late anyway. The building management had already approved our request to use the lobby for the community meeting, and legally, once the petition was filed, the process had to move forward. The confrontation came 2 days before the scheduled meeting. Pamela cornered me in the lobby while I was checking my mail, and for the first time, I saw real desperation in her eyes. Not just anger or frustration, but the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes their entire world is about to collapse. "You have no idea what you've started," she hissed, standing so close I could smell her perfume, mixed with what might have been alcohol. "I will destroy you for this. I will make your life so miserable you'll beg to move out. This lobby will never become your circus." I looked at her calmly, noting how her hands were shaking and her voice was getting higher with each threat, and said, "It's not my circus, Pamela. It's our community." But even as I said it, I could see in her face that desperate people do desperate things, and I had a feeling our final confrontation was going to be bigger than either of us expected. We weren't staging a rebellion. We were just sitting in the place we'd paid for. Saturday at 7 p.m., the lobby of our building hosted the largest gathering in its history. 28 residents showed up, more than 2/3 of the occupied units, including people I'd never seen at any community event before. I'd arranged the chairs in a circle rather than the courtroom-style setup Pamela preferred, and Frank agreed to moderate as the senior resident and the most respected person in the building. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, like people who'd been living under occupation, finally seeing liberation within reach. You could feel the electricity in the air. Neighbors who'd been isolated and afraid were finally coming together as a real community for the first time in years. I presented the case against Pamela's leadership calmly and factually, making sure to stick to documented violations and witness accounts rather than personal attacks. I outlined the unauthorized rules not found in our HOA bylaws, the systematic harassment of residents through frivolous fines and complaints, the false claims about her authority to control our daily lives, and the hostile living environment she'd created that had driven away 8 families in 5 years. I showed copies of the original HOA documents proving she'd never been legally elected, and I presented the petition with 19 signatures requesting her removal. Everything was calm, professional, and completely legal. Then we opened the floor for residents to share their experiences, and the stories that poured out were even worse than I'd imagined. One woman talked about how Pamela had threatened to have her daughter's car towed for visiting too often, claiming that overnight guests were disrupting the community character. A man shared that he'd received a noise complaint for sneezing in the hallway at 10 in the morning, followed by a formal warning about excessive biological functions in common areas. Another resident described how Pamela had demanded written permission for him to hang a Christmas wreath on his own apartment door, then rejected the request because red and green weren't appropriate seasonal colors for our aesthetic. The veteran from the 6th floor stood up and told everyone about the panic attacks he'd started having whenever he saw Pamela in the hallways, and how a man who'd survived combat was being terrorized in his own home by a woman with a clipboard. As person after person stood up to share their experiences, I could see the community's anger building. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about basic human dignity and the right to live in peace in homes we'd paid for. At 7:45, just as we were preparing to call the formal vote, Pamela made her dramatic entrance. She burst through the lobby doors with her clipboard and her phone already in her hand, looking like a general whose fortress was under siege and who was ready to burn it down rather than surrender it. "This gathering is illegal!" she shouted loud enough for the entire building to hear, her voice echoing off the marble walls and probably audible 3 floors up. "You are all trespassing in common areas. This is an unauthorized assembly." Frank tried to maintain order and democratic process. "Pamela, this is an official community meeting under our HOA bylaws. You're welcome to participate in the democratic process and have your say." But Pamela wasn't interested in democracy or community input or anything resembling civilized discourse. "I don't participate," she screamed, her face turning red and spittle flying from her mouth. "I lead! I am the authority here!" Without any further discussion or attempt at reasoning, she dialed 911 right there in front of all of us. "I need police immediately," she said into the phone, speaking loud enough that everyone could hear her lies. "Multiple residents are trespassing and holding an illegal assembly in violation of building rules. They're refusing to disperse when ordered by proper authority." The 28 residents looked at each other in complete disbelief. She was actually calling the police on all of us for sitting in our own lobby, for exercising our legal rights as homeowners, for participating in the democratic process. I stood up and addressed the group. "Everyone stay calm. We're doing absolutely nothing wrong. We followed proper procedures, we have documentation, and we have every right to be here." But I could see the worry on people's faces. Many of these folks had never been involved in any kind of confrontation with law enforcement, and the idea of police coming because of them was genuinely frightening. When Officers Martinez and Johnson arrived 8 minutes later, I was relieved to see Martinez again. He'd been here before and understood the situation. But Johnson was young and inexperienced, and Pamela immediately launched into the performance of her lifetime. "Officers, thank God you're here. These people are conspiring against me. They're holding an illegal assembly in violation of building codes. That man there," she pointed directly at me with a shaking finger, "is the ringleader who organized this whole thing. He won't leave when ordered by proper authority." Johnson, without bothering to assess the situation or ask for any documentation, stepped toward me aggressively. "Sir, I need you to step back from the group." I tried to explain calmly. "Officer, this is a legal community meeting under our HOA bylaws. I have all the documentation right here showing we followed proper procedures." But Johnson was already escalating, probably thinking he was dealing with some kind of domestic terrorism situation. "I said step back." And before I knew what was happening, before I could say another word, I heard the terrifying click of handcuffs snapping around my wrists. The lobby absolutely erupted. 28 voices simultaneously shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" And "He didn't do anything." And "This is insane." Frank jumped to his feet, his face red with indignation. "Officer, this man organized a completely legal meeting under our HOA bylaws. I have all the paperwork right here. This is America, not Soviet Russia." But it was Officer Martinez who saved the situation. His years of experience immediately recognized that his partner had made a serious, potentially lawsuit-worthy mistake, and he quickly intervened. "Johnson, hold on. Stop. Let me see that documentation." Frank handed over the petition with 19 signatures, the relevant sections of our HOA bylaws showing proper procedure, and copies of the building management approval for the meeting. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. As Martinez reviewed the documents with growing understanding, Pamela realized she was losing control of the narrative and went into full psychological meltdown mode. "Don't listen to them. They're all conspiring against me. I am the HOA president. I built this community from nothing. I made the rules that keep this place civilized. Nobody challenged me before because they knew I was right." Her voice was getting shriller and more unhinged with each sentence. "That man is a threat to my authority. He's trying to destroy everything I've worked for. I decide who belongs here and who doesn't. This is my building." And that's when she made the fatal mistake that sealed her fate forever. In her panic and rage and complete psychological breakdown, she'd admitted in front of 2 police officers and 28 witnesses that this was all about her personal power, not community welfare or building management or anything resembling legitimate authority. Officer Martinez had heard enough. He turned to his partner and said quietly but firmly, Uncuff him. Now? Then he looked at me and said, "Sorry about that, sir." Complete misunderstanding. Then he turned to Pamela with the expression of a man who'd dealt with too many crazy people in his career. "Ma'am, you filed a false police report about trespassing. These people live here, they own their units, and they followed proper legal procedures for this meeting." But Pamela's complete psychological break was just getting started. She was like a cornered animal now, lashing out at everything and everyone. "You don't understand. I'm in charge. They can't vote me out. I am the board. I make the decisions. This is my domain." She actually started trying to physically push residents toward the door, screaming, "Get out of my lobby! All of you get out!" while her clipboard fell to the floor and scattered papers everywhere. That's when Officer Martinez made the decision that 28 residents had been waiting years to see. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for filing a false police report and disturbing the peace." As he read Pamela her rights in language she could understand and clicked the handcuffs around her wrists. The visual was everything I could have hoped for and more. Just 10 minutes earlier, I had been the one in handcuffs while she stood there gloating and triumphant, thinking she'd finally destroyed me. Now, she was the one being led away in restraints while I rubbed the red marks on my wrists and watched justice finally being served. The irony was so perfect it felt like a movie scene, except this was real life and real justice and real consequences for a real bully who'd terrorized real people for too long. The moment the lobby door closed behind Pamela and the officers, the entire room burst into applause that probably woke up half the building. People were hugging, crying, and celebrating like prisoners who'd just been liberated from a concentration camp. Some folks were actually sobbing with relief. Years of suppressed fear and anger finally being released in one cathartic moment. We proceeded with our vote, and the result was never in doubt. 26 out of 28 residents voted to remove Pamela from any leadership role whatsoever. Frank was elected as interim president, and several people enthusiastically suggested I should take the position permanently, but I declined without hesitation. I didn't fight for power, I told them, looking around at all these neighbors who'd become friends and allies. I just wanted to read my book in peace, in the place I bled and worked and saved for 35 years to afford. That's all I ever wanted. In the weeks that followed, all of Pamela's arbitrary rules were abolished in a single emergency meeting. Coffee Friday became a beloved weekly tradition that sometimes drew 40 people, and the lobby returned to being what it was always meant to be. A community space where neighbors could gather freely without fear or intimidation. Pamela was formally charged with filing false police reports and harassment, and when word got around the building about her arrest, 3 more residents came forward with stories of threats and intimidation they'd been too scared to report before. She eventually moved out of the building entirely, though rumor has it she's trying to get elected to another HOA somewhere across town. God help those poor people. As I sit here now in that same lobby, coffee in hand, and Automotive magazine open on my lap, surrounded by the quiet conversations of neighbors who've become genuine friends, I can't help but smile at how perfectly everything worked out. Sometimes the system works exactly like it's supposed to. Sometimes bullies do get their comeuppance in the most poetic way possible. And sometimes, when you stand up for what's right and bring a community together against a common threat, justice really is served with a side of beautiful irony. Turns out those handcuffs weren't wrong. They were just on the wrong person for about 10 minutes. And sometimes, that's all it takes to set a whole community free.
That's it for now from QA Stories. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell's on. The next story might just top this one.